Did you know that advertising eggs as healthy food is not allowed? It may sound crazy, but let's get cracking on a different kind of experiment. With virtual eggs, we're diving into the world of thinking particles multiphysics to whip up a virtual breakfast that's 100% healthy and completely free of salmonella or E. coli. Join us as we explore the possibilities.
Okay, let's smash an egg and dive right into it. Smashing an egg, and especially doing a visualization of smashing an egg, is a pretty complex task, and I'm going to explain all the things we have to be considering when we want to simulate this kind of effect. But before we do so, I'll go and explain what we have here in the scene as the basic setup. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll turn off the thinking particles. So right now thinking particles is off and we have just our plain 3D Studio Max scene. And you can see we have here a camera, two lights and a floor. And I'm going to show you all the objects we have here. And we have multiple objects. Let me just change the viewport here and have a look. So here we have our egg. Let me just zoom in every viewport. And we can see there's an egg yolk as well. And we have the egg in a little bit tilted position so that we can get our smashing real nice. Those are standard 3D Studio objects, 3D Studio Max objects, and let me just select one and then you can see what we can do with this object here. You can see it's a geosphere, squeeze, and a shell. So why did I use the shell? I used the shell to get a hollow area or a hollow volume inside of the egg. And that's practically all we have. So let me turn off the egg, the main outer eggshell. And we have still something remaining, and that's an object that is called fluid volume. So this is one-sided object. So that's our inner volume. We want to use this inner volume to fill with egg white and our yolk. So how and why did we do that? Let me just turn back on. Let me just zoom into the edge here. Let me turn back on our main egg and I'll turn off right now the volume. As you can see, the volume is the inner side of our eggshell. So that's the thickness of our eggshell, and inside is our egg volume or fluid volume for our egg white. The next thing we have is this sphere, which is, let me just turn off the egg volume as well. The remaining part we have here is our egg yolk. So the egg yolk is just a sphere, nothing special. And we will use this to define where inside of the volume we want to have our egg yolk for the fluid simulation. I'll explain later in detail when and how we pick these kind of objects. So the fluid volume and the egg yolk, they are just helper objects. So we don't need to have them really, except as helper objects to tell us where the volume is. So the main or the important object is our egg. Let me just turn that on. That's what we see, and the rest will be our fluid simulation. So after we have all these three objects. So we have the eggshell, the egg yolk volume, and the fluid volume. We have the floor object, which is a standard box, nothing special as well, and some lights and cameras, and that's it. So now let's start working with these objects. And in Thinking Particles, let me now bring up our Thinking Particles interface. And in Thinking Particles, let me just zoom out here a little bit, and yes, here we go. So in Thinking Particles, let me bring up the Thinking Particles user interface. In the Thinking Particles user interface, I will now access all the objects we have in 3D Studio Max, and we will use them to create our fluid, to create our egg cracking or the cracking of our eggshell, and the egg yolk simulation as well. So let me start with the particle groups. We have a particle group called gravity, and inside of this gravity particle group, I have a rigid body dynamics group, RBD, and I have a broken group. The broken group is actually for our eggshell when it's broken, and the rigid body is our complete or whole egg. And then, let me just turn that back. We have a fluid, which will be our egg white, and we have our egg yolk as well. So we have two groups, particle groups for our fluid simulation. Then we have a volume particle group where we put our fluid volume, and we have an impact cell particle group as well. So the impact cell particle group, I will explain later why we need that and why we wanted to create that. That's about it. That's our setup. In the gravity, that's the most important group. We have the rigid bodies and both fluids. So everything in here will receive gravity. And we can have a peek at it right now with the forces dynamic set. And in the forces dynamic set, we can see gravity is our main group, includes all subgroups. So everything that's underneath gravity will receive this force. The only thing that does not have gravity or will not have gravity is our floor, or it will float away, and we don't want that. However, the floor is a special case, and I'll explain later how we get the floor into our simulation. So let's start with our first dynamic set here. In the create dynamic set, we have an object to particle. This operator will bring objects from 3D Studio Max into our Thinking Particles simulation system. And we can see here, I picked the object egg, and the egg object is our whole egg with the shell and the inner volume empty. And we make sure we take the object to particle. That means we can rotate, animate the object, and it will grab the position and rotation at the time where we call the object to particle. And we have a representation of this egg inside of 3D Studio Max and Thinking Particles. The important part here is we have to turn on instance shape. We want to have the mesh because we need to do some visual effects with the mesh. So that's the important part. We grab the object from 3D Studio Max, put it inside of Thinking Particles, and we grab the mesh as well. Then we assign some important parameters to this object we got into our Thinking Particle simulation. The first thing is we're doing a bullet physics simulation. The bullet physics simulation takes care about collisions and doing rigid body dynamics. So we assign to this egg object a convex hull simulation, and we also have it active and give it some basic parameters like friction, rolling, and margins for collisions. So these are pretty standard, and usually you would find those parameters which work best by trying out with trial and error and settle on parameters that give you the result you're after. The next parameter or node we have here is mass. We have to assign a mass to the eggshell, and I will discuss how the mass influences our simulation, but for now we just assign a mass to our particle, and then we have a velocity as well. We assign a velocity so that we have right from the start an initial velocity. We could have everything driven by force, but then we would need to wait for 20 or 30 frames until the gravity kicks in and accelerates our object. So I want to give it an initial velocity as well. And I'm doing that here just with the velocity node and setting it to a speed of 10. The next object to particle will bring in our fluid volume helper, or our object we created. That's the inside of our egg minus the shell thickness. So we can be sure we create our fluid inside of our egg and not outside or right at the border of our eggshell. Same deal here. We choose the object to particle, so we get the rotation and everything and position. And we also make sure we have instance shape because we need the shape to get the volume of our object here. And we put that in the group volume. I forgot about the volume here. We put the eggshell into the particle group rigid body dynamics. And the volume lands in the volume group, as we can see here, the volume group. So the next thing we have here is our simple deform. And we are not using the simple deform to do a soft body or deformation. We are just using or abusing simple deform to actually just create volume particles in a very simple, easy, straightforward way. So I turn off the vertex particle. That's would be needed for deformation. I'm just turning this off, and now I'm just using this as a particle generator. So that's a very simple, straightforward. It's one node. I can fill a volume. I just specify the raster, the margin, the mass of each individual particle that's created, and the size of the particle. And that's all. So one node creates a volume or fills a volume. Really easy, straightforward thing. I'll assign the same velocity as my eggshell. So that's important. So the fluid has right from the start the same velocity. So my fluid stays inside of my eggshell. Then, when the particles are created, I want to have some of the particles volume because the egg is not all egg white. We have the yolk in the center. So I want to make sure that from the egg white particles we create, we also create the particles for the egg yolk. I'll do that with a very simple thing. I use the egg yolk object, our sphere. We call that egg yolk. And this node or this object, I'm doing an in-mesh test. So whenever a particle that is here created in our egg volume falls inside of our egg volume or egg yolk, I'm activating this and moving this particle to the egg yolk particle group. So right now we are creating, let me just go back to the simple deform. We are creating volume particles in the fluid particle group. And I'll move those particles when they fall inside of my egg yolk volume. I move them into the separate group egg yolk. So I'm kind of creating in one go all the volume particles inside of the egg, but I'm sorting them later. So let's move on to the next dynamic set. The forces we already did, that's our gravity. Now to the most important part, that's our simulation. The simulation at first looks a little bit overwhelming, but again, if we look closer, it's all logic and easy to understand and grasp. Let me just start with the top part. These nodes here are just our fluid simulation. So that's the egg white and egg yolk. The part down here is our rigid body dynamic simulation. That's the breaking egg and colliding eggshells and colliding egg. Let's have a look first on the physics rigid body dynamics first. So for that, I'm doing a little trick. I'll turn off our fluid simulation by not creating any fluid particles. So when thinking particles, or when nodes in general, detect, oh, there's nothing to do for me, the nodes don't do anything. This is usually what you would want or expect. So that means right now we are not doing any expensive fluid simulation here. So right now our bullet physics will be really fast, and we can have a look in the viewport how this simulation looks like. So let me just probably close this user interface and just get that viewport here a little bit bigger and use the camera view. And now I'll just play back, and just as a reminder, I'm doing a audio video recording on the same machine where I do the simulation. So whenever I do a simulation, I'm not talking because this will somehow distort the sound recording. So let's start right now playing back so that we can see what's going on here. And there we go. We have our physics simulation. So the eggshell is breaking, everything is colliding with the floor, everything looks nice and how we want to have the simulation. So let's have a look now. How did we do the rigid body setup? As I mentioned before, in our create dynamic set where we got the eggshell in, we just assigned the BT rigid body dynamics parameters. We use the convex hull, that's our eggshell, activate it, have a mass and velocity going on, and in our simulation part, the bullet physics is taking in another node, which is an object from the 3D Studio Max scene, and we are using the floor object as our floor node. That means bullet physics knows exactly, okay, I need to collide with a floor object. And then bullet physics knows exactly what to do with the floor. I set it to box collision, give it some friction, rolling friction, and collision margin. Simple setups. Again, you can find the proper settings by just trial and error. It's so fast, as you can see in the previous playback we had here. It's so fast and easy to set up. And here comes the interesting part, and I'm trying to explain what we did here, because we're doing here a little bit of trickery. And we have to do that because bullet physics has restricted data it can put out. And also there's a lot of things going on inside of bullet physics. So what we are doing here first is I have an in-group condition. So whenever a particle is in the rigid body dynamics group, I'll do something. However, I also do something when a collision happens. So my collision output from the bullet physics is going into an AND operator, and my particle output is going into the in-group condition. So right now we have two conditions that need to be fulfilled. The particle needs to be a rigid body, so our eggshell. It needs to collide with the floor object. So anything that collides with the floor object and that is a rigid body dynamics particle or in the rigid body dynamics group will trigger this event. So we get the collision and we know, oh, it's our eggshell that's colliding. And then when both conditions are true, we output a true and start a timer. And we also start under a separate condition at the same time a position born. We create new particles, get our collision position. So where happened the position, and feed that into our position point. So we create particles around the impact point. And we create 50 particles around our impact point with a distance of 50 millimeters or a radius of 50 millimeters. So when the particle collision happens or the eggshell collides with the floor, we are creating at the impact point new particles. We start the timer. And then we are taking the time and we have a value to value node that we can ramp up, ramp down, can do all kinds of things where we activate or how we activate our volume break. However, right now the timer is set at 0. That means it's instantly. And that's what we want to do right now for the tutorial. So the next thing we have here in our chain of the rigid body simulation part is the volume breaker. So we want to break our egg shell at the impact point. So not really. What we want to do is kind of simulate or control how our eggshell breaks apart. And we want to have a higher density at the impact point. And to get the higher density at the impact point, we are creating our cells or particles, that's the center of a volume breaker cell where the object should break, with 50 particles. So at the impact point, we have more cells than away from the impact point. And volume breaker, let me just go down, will create our cracks and broken off parts of the eggshell, and it will do that with the help of the impact cell. So the position-borne operator is creating the new particles, the 50 particles, in the particle group called impact cell. So the impact cell we access here in volume breaker, we also tell the operator, create all the broken off shells or parts of the eggshell, put these in the broken particle group. And the broken particle group is the subgroup of our rigid body dynamics group. So here we break off the parts of the eggshell, put them in the broken particle group. That's the part of where we break off, put it in the particle group, and down here we decide, okay, we use the impact cell particles, the extra particles we created, and we want to have the cells merge with our raster. So we have a basic or default breaking of our eggshell, but we want to refine our eggshell breaking with the impact cell cells we just created. And then the important part, another important part, is the material ID is set to 4 for our edges or newly created fragments. Then each broken part of our eggshell receives a velocity, and we do that because when we create the broken off parts, they have at the point of creation a velocity of 0. So before the gravity kicks in, it would be too late. And because we are way down, we already have the acceleration of gravity and our initial velocity. So we give it the same speed, so everything falls at the same time. The next node we're using here is the shape noise. The shape noise allows us to give a rough edge and not a clean cut. So that helps us to rough up a little bit the edges of our broken off parts. And I use the material ID 4. Remember, I just told you here in the volume break, we assign the material ID 4 for our broken off edges. And then the shape noise will get that, and we can give it a fall off value, tessellation value, and the noise, how much distortion we want to have on the edges. Then we assign a mass to these broken off particles, and these broken off eggshells should have the same mass as our initial object. And then we also assign BT rigid body dynamics parameter set, and that's probably practically the same rigid body parameter set as we have for the eggshell. And then our cycle or circle is closed. We have our rigid body bullet dynamics sorted out here. So everything we have here now discussed is taking care of the rigid body dynamics effects. Now let's have a look at our fluid dynamics effect. And you can see already we have a time interval here. And this time interval starts at 95. And why did I do that for the flow solver? Remember, the egg is falling down for some amount of time until it hits the ground. And the ground collision happens around frame 96. So I'll just tell the flow solver, hey, you don't have to bother with flow or fluid simulation at all until frame 95. Then the flow solver kicks in. In the time before, from 0 to 95, the particles will just fly along with the eggshell. So that's totally fine and a really clever way to optimize our simulation. And we can also do that with other aspects of our simulation, for example, the surface. That means we are creating out of the particle simulation a fluid surface for the egg white, and we are creating a fluid surface for the egg yolk. Same deal here. We are using the interval and we turn on the egg white. Oh, we should do that at the same time. 95 here. So that's also a nice optimization. We don't need any mesh inside of the egg white, of the eggshell, because we can't see it or see through the eggshell. So let's have a look now at our fluid simulation. That is the part here. Those nodes are responsible for our fluid simulation. Let's have a look what we did here. We have the flow group, and this flow group is responsible for the fluid particles, or the particles that are in the fluid group. And that's our egg white. And probably we want to rename that into flow group egg white. So now we know this is for the egg white, and probably we also want to rename this one into flow group our egg yolk. So we have two flow or fluid groups. So the first one is our egg white, and we want to have both the egg white and egg yolk kind of the same behavior, I would say. So all the parameters we have here, we have to duplicate. So when I did the setup for the scene, I started with the egg white and then just moved over and copied the flow group for the egg white and have a starting point for my egg yolk. The only thing different is I have a higher viscosity for the egg yolk. I use for the egg yolk 1.0, and here for the egg white I use 0.6. So the egg white is more liquid than the egg yolk. That's the only difference. And I also want to have the egg yolk less splashy, so I'll reduce the decompress amount. So that's the force that is used to react on compression. So when fluid is compressed, how much force should it take to counter the compression? So I reduced that here. In contrast, let me just switch here, contrast to our egg white where I have 4,500. But all the rest is the same setup. And again, you'll find these settings and parameters by trial and error. But when you have found the proper settings, you can create and go to the next step and create the surface. And the surface for the fluids is a simple OpenVDB shape for the egg white and the yolk. So we have two different meshes acting on two different groups. Let me just click on the OpenVDB shape for the egg white. We get our particles from the fluid group. And the same for the yolk. We get our particles to create the surface from the egg yolk particle group. And that's our setup. So that's the whole setup we have here. And now let me show you and talk a little bit about the fluid simulation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off the mesh display. So keep in mind, I'm just turning off the mesh, so we won't see any eggshells, but we will now see the fluid. So I'll enable our fluid simulation. So that creates now the volume particles. That's actually it. Let me just check. Yes, everything is on and okay here. So now I'll close this and I'll go back with our simulation. Let me just go to our view. And up here you can see we have here our volume or particles of the egg white. And let me just go into a perspective view. And when we look close, let me just make this a little bigger. We can see we have particles inside, these yellow particles inside. That's our egg yolk volume. So these particles are those that we have sorted with our, when we create these particles up here. Let me just go back here so that you see with the in mesh. So everything that's inside of this object, egg yolk, our sphere, is going into a separate group, the egg yolk. And that's what we see here. Let's play back this simulation here. So that's our fluid simulation here. And if we wanted, we could now start and activate our surface. Now step one frame forward to get the surface. And now the surface is calculated, but keep in mind we turned off the mesh display. So if we wanted to see the actual surface, we need to go back into our master dynamic and turn show mesh back on. And now we have our mesh here. And we can see the mesh much better from above, and we can see how many fine details we can get from our egg white and egg yolk in here. So let me just go back and turn off the mesh display. So I'll turn off the show mesh, and I'll also turn off the surface creation because that's taking some time to process and render. So now let's talk a little bit about the fluid simulation. So the important part of the fluid simulation is that we make sure that we have a proper balance of our density, fluid density, and decompress force, as well as our tension and viscosity. So everything plays together and needs to find a proper balance. And I just want to show you the impact or influence a change in density would have. Let me just reduce the density right now here to a 0.35. And keep in mind that's from 0.5. So what I'm doing right now is I'm telling the system the density is much, much higher. So the forces to keep those particles away are now much bigger right now. So that means when we do the simulation again, and you can see right there, it's a much more violent splash that's happening. So for an egg that's unrealistic, it looks more like water. It's a real powerful splash we are seeing here. And that's just changing one parameter. So adjusting the fluids is some trial and error, but you can get there really fast because the fluid simulator is so fast, and you can start with a lower resolution with less particles and then increase the particles. So that's about what we can do here. And that's also I wanted to show you and explain how we did the setup for the egg yolk and how we are able to do this kind of simulations. One other important part, and I'll repeat that, is when we are doing a coupled physics simulation, the order of operation is important. So what does that mean? When we look in our dynamic set tree, we can see that we have a certain order going on. We have our bullet physics right above all the flow solver. So we want to have the bullet physics first and then the flow solver. And we can change it around and get different results. So sometimes it makes sense to have first the fluid and then the bullet physics kick in and bring back the fluid particles. And in the next step, the fluid solvers will use those particles and do something else. So that's the important part. The order plays a role with these things. And to get a proper simulation, we have integrated or implemented in our flow solver an option where we control the external solver so that we know exactly that this is the right order. So what you can do is you just feed that into the on button. And now, let me just move that over here. I'll use the control key. And now we can be sure when the flow solver is done, it feeds into the bullet physics solver. So now the order is properly as it should be. And we can have a look at the order again, including our mesh for the fluids and eggshell. Let me just, let's keep the surface off for now, but just let's have a look. And I'll dial down or dial back our modifications we did here, our violent Splashing, I'll dial that back to 0.5. That was just to show you that one individual parameter is affecting a lot our fluid solution. So let's go back here to our initial frame and have a look at it right now. And there we go. Let's do one last modification and then we're done with this tutorial. Let me just turn on our surface, and the surface will be automatically created in the next simulation step. And there we go, we have our surface, and now we can just go and render with final render. We have assigned the materials for everything. We just go in here, render a single frame. And there we go. There's our rendering. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope I could show you some little tricks and tips with thinking particles and how to do a combined fluid and rigid body simulation. Thank you for watching this tutorial and see you later. Goodbye.